Patrick Stewart left without warning. Not between segments. Not at a commercial break. In the middle of a sentence, his own sentence, a story he had been building with the careful architectural pleasure of a man who has spent 60 years understanding that the structure of a story is as important as its content. His voice simply stopped. He set down the glass of water he had been holding. He stood up from the chair. He placed something on the desk in front of Jimmy Fallon, something small and folded, held shut with nothing but the pressure of a fold. He looked at Jimmy for a moment with an expression that was not apology and not performance and not anything that had a clean name. And then he walked off the stage. Not toward the wing, not toward the exit, toward the back of the studio, down the stairs, into the darkness beyond the lights, moving with the deliberate unhurry of a man executing a plan that no one else in the building knew existed until this moment, including, it would become clear, the producer in the wing, the stage manager at his station, and the director in the control room who had just said something into her headset that nobody answered. Jimmy Fallon looked at the note on the desk. He did not pick it up immediately. He sat in the specific stillness of a person trying to understand the shape of what has just happened before moving inside it. His hands were on the desk on either side of the folded paper. He looked at it the way you look at something that has arrived without sufficient context, trying to read the weight of it from the outside, trying to understand what category of thing this is before committing to the act of opening it. 300 people were completely silent. The band had not moved. The cameras were still rolling because nobody had told them to stop, and because stopping felt, to every person with their hand near a button, like the wrong instinct. Jimmy looked up once, toward the back of the studio where Patrick Stewart had walked, where the darkness near the entrance had swallowed him without drama. Then he looked back at the note. He picked it up. He unfolded it. He read it. His face did not change quickly. It changed the way faces change when the information arriving through the eyes is taking a moment to travel the full distance to wherever it needs to go. The expression staying neutral, almost carefully neutral. And then something moving underneath it, something gathering. And then a stillness that was not composure, but its opposite. Not the managed stillness of someone holding themselves together, but the involuntary stillness of someone who has been stopped completely by what they are reading. He looked up from the note. He looked at the back of the studio. Then he did something that had not been planned, that was not in the rundown, that would not have occurred to anyone to plan. He read the note aloud. Not performing it, just reading it, quietly, into the microphone, as if Patrick Stewart had left it for the room and not just for him. It was a Monday night taping. November 2021. The Tonight Show. Patrick Stewart was 81 years old and had arrived that evening with the quality he carried everywhere. The quality of someone so thoroughly inhabited by their own history that their presence in a room is not simply presence, but a kind of sediment. The accumulated weight of 81 years of a life lived almost entirely in language, in the service of other people's words, and, by that service, in the discovery of his own. He had walked onto that stage, and the audience had received him with a particular reverence reserved for people who have been part of the inner life, not just the cultural life, not just the entertainment life, but the inner life. The place where people go alone, for long enough that they are no longer separable from the landscape of that place. He had waved the ovation down with the brisk, slightly embarrassed efficiency of a man who has never made peace with being celebrated, and has decided that the most dignified response is to get through it as quickly as possible. The interview had been extraordinary from the first moment. Rigorous and warm and funny and digressive in the way that conversations with people who have read everything tend to be digressive, full of unexpected connections and sudden depths. The kind of conversation that makes late-night television remember what it is occasionally capable of. The room had been fully alive. Everything had been right. Then Patrick Stewart had set down his glass of water mid-sentence and stood up and placed a folded note on the desk and walked off the stage into the back of the studio. And Jimmy Fallon had read what was written on it aloud, quietly, into the microphone, to 300 people who were holding their breath. The note said, "Row 7, third seat from the left. I need 5 minutes. Please wait. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in 1958. Patrick Stewart was not always Patrick Stewart. He was not yet the captain, not yet the professor, not yet the knight, not yet the man whose voice had become one of the most recognized instruments in the English-speaking world, a voice built not in a recording studio or a film set, but in the specific, demanding, unforgiving workshop of classical theater, of Shakespeare performed in repertory to audiences who knew the text and would not forgive a careless line. In the spring of 1958, he was 17 years old, and he was from Mirfield, in the West Riding of Yorkshire, and he was the son of a man who had come back from the war, carrying things that the war had put inside him and that he had never found a way to set down, and who expressed what he carried in the way that some men of that generation expressed it, through the body, through the house, through the family that lived inside the house. Patrick had learned early and thoroughly what it meant to live in a space where the air was never entirely safe. And he had found, with the instinct of someone whose survival depends on finding it, the one place where the air was different. That place was the Mirfield Parish Drama Group, which met on Friday evenings in the basement of St. Paul's Church, and which was run by a man named Cecil Dormand, who taught English at the local secondary school, and who had been running the drama group for 11 years with the particular dedication of someone who believes, without needing it confirmed, that what he is doing matters. Cecil Dormand was not a theatrical man in the showy sense. He was a careful man, a precise man. A man who treated language as the primary instrument of human dignity, and who communicated this conviction to his students not through speeches about it, but through the daily practice of taking words seriously. Every word, in every line, in every scene, in every Friday evening in the basement of St. Paul's Church. Patrick had come to the group at 14, brought by a teacher who had recognized something in him and had made the specific, consequential decision to do something about the recognition rather than simply note it. He had sat in the circle on his first Friday evening and listened to Cecil Dormand talk about a scene from Shakespeare. Not the meaning of the scene, not the historical context, not the academic apparatus that surrounds the plays like scaffolding around a building. The words themselves. Each word. What each word was doing. Why that word and not another word? What would be lost if a different word stood in its place? Patrick had listened with the absolute attention of someone hearing. For the first time, a language he already knew described as the thing it actually was. He had come back every Friday for 3 years. In the spring of 1958, the drama group staged a production of Henry V in the parish hall above the basement. The first full production Cecil had attempted, ambitious beyond anything the group had previously tried, requiring 12 performers for a cast that Shakespeare had written for 50. Requiring ingenuity and commitment and the willingness to believe that what you are doing in a parish hall in Mirfield is as serious as what is being done in any theater in England. Cecil had treated it as exactly that serious. The production had rehearsed for 4 months. The costumes had been made by hand by 3 women from the congregation. The set had been built by Cecil and 2 fathers of cast members across a series of Saturdays in the parish hall with borrowed tools and donated wood. Patrick Stewart had played the king. He had been 17 years old, and he had stood on the stage of the Muirfield Parish Hall on a Friday evening in April 1958 and delivered the speech before Agincourt, "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers," to an audience of perhaps 90 people, most of whom knew him as the boy from Solwood Grain, whose father worked at the factory and whose mother took in sewing. And he had delivered it with a completeness and a conviction that silenced the room in a way that Cecil Dormond, watching from the back with his arms folded, understood immediately as the thing he had been watching for across 11 years of Friday evenings in a basement. In the audience that night, in the 4th row, was a woman named Vera Hutchings, who was 51 years old, and who had come because her granddaughter was playing a minor role, and who had no particular investment in theater, and who had spent the first portion of the evening with the polite, slightly dutiful attention of a grandmother who has come to support a grandchild and is prepared to be patient. Then a 17-year-old boy had begun to speak, and her patience had converted, without warning, into something else entirely. She was not an educated woman in the formal sense. She had left school at 14 and worked in a mill and married and raised children and buried a husband and lived the life that the West Riding of Yorkshire in the middle of the 20th century offered to women of her background and circumstance. A life that was not small in the ways that mattered, but that did not include. As a rule, the experience of sitting in a parish hall and having the inside of your chest rearranged by a 17-year-old boy saying someone else's words. After the performance, she had gone to the stage door, the parish hall's side entrance, which served as a stage door by virtue of being where the performers emerged. She had waited. When Patrick came out, she had stepped forward, the way Celestine Marsh would step forward at a stage door in Atlanta 33 years later, in the way that people step forward when they have been given something and cannot leave without acknowledging the giving. She had said, "I want to tell you something. I don't know much about acting. I don't go to the theater, but I want to tell you that something happened to me tonight when you spoke, and I have never had that happen before, and I think you should know that it happened." Patrick Stewart had looked at her. He had been 17 years old, standing in the April evening in his costume, with the stage paint not entirely removed from his face, and he had been looked at by this woman with a directness and a seriousness that he was not accustomed to receiving from adults, and he had understood, without being able to name the understanding, that she was giving him something. He had said, "Thank you for telling me." She had said, "I mean it. Whatever this is that you do, don't stop. Don't let anything stop you. Some people have a thing and most people don't, and you have it, and that's not nothing. That's everything. Don't stop." She had gone back to her granddaughter. Patrick had stood in the April evening for a moment after she left and then gone back inside. He had never forgotten her. Not her name, he had not known her name. But the face, the directness, the specific words, "Don't let anything stop you." He had carried them through everything that followed. Through the Bristol Old Vic Theatre School, through the repertory years, through the Royal Shakespeare Company, through the decades of stage work, and then the television, and then the films, and then the second life that the 24th century had unexpectedly provided him. Through all of it, through every moment when something had threatened to stop him, he had heard those words in that voice, standing in the April evening outside a parish hall in Muirfield, and he had not stopped. He had tried to find her. In 1967, returned to Muirfield for a visit, he had asked about her through the parish, describing her, describing the evening. He had been told her name and had been told she had moved to Bradford to be near her daughter. He had found an address and written a letter in 1967 that he was not certain had reached her. He had tried again in 1974, and again in 1989, and each time had reached a version of the trail that went cold before it resolved. He had mentioned her in an interview once, in 2003, briefly, not naming her, saying only that a woman had spoken to him after his first performance and had given him something he had carried his entire career, and that he had never been able to thank her properly. The woman's granddaughter, the minor role granddaughter from the fourth row in 1958, was 81 years old now and lived in Leeds. Her name was Margaret. She had seen the 2003 interview. She had understood immediately who he was describing. She had written to him through his agent with a letter that explained who she was and what she knew, and that her grandmother, Vera Hutchings, had passed away in 1979 at the age of 72, having lived long enough to see Patrick Stewart become the thing she had told him he was going to become, and having watched his career with the particular proprietary tenderness of someone who had recognized something before the world did. Margaret had received a letter back from Patrick Stewart in 2003 that she had kept in a wooden box on her dresser for 18 years. She had brought it to New York at the suggestion of the Tonight Show producer who had found her through the 2003 interview, who had found a trail that Patrick Stewart's own searches had not uncovered. The producer had called Margaret in September 2021 and explained what she was planning. Margaret had said, in the direct northern way of a woman raised in the West Riding of Yorkshire, "Tell me exactly what you need me to do, and I'll do it." She was sitting in row 7, third seat from the left, having arrived when the studio doors opened and having sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the stage for the entire taping. Watching Patrick Stewart be interviewed on a Monday night in New York. Understanding, as she watched him, the specific and vertiginous experience of watching someone become what your grandmother told them they would become. Patrick Stewart had known she was there. The producer had told him before the taping, in his dressing room, quietly, she had shown him Margaret's letter. She had told him Margaret had brought something. She had said, "We'll find the right moment." He had nodded once and said nothing. He had walked out onto the stage and conducted an 80-minute interview with the full and complete attention of a man who was also, underneath the interview, carrying something that was waiting for the right moment to be set down. He had found the right moment mid-sentence, not planned. Just the moment presenting itself as the right moment presents itself, unmistakably, and requiring the courage to act on it, without hesitation. He had written the note in the dressing room before the taping. He had kept it in his jacket pocket. He had placed it on the desk and walked off the stage and into the audience, to row 7, third seat from the left, where Margaret was already standing. Jimmy Fallon had read the note aloud to 300 people and then sat in silence with it in his hands, while somewhere in the back of the studio, Patrick Stewart and Margaret stood facing each other in the aisle. She said, "She told me about that evening, not once, many times. She told me about a boy who spoke and what happened to the room when he spoke." Patrick Stewart said, "She told me not to stop." Margaret said, "She would have been so glad to know you heard her. She always wondered." Patrick Stewart said, "I heard her. I have heard her every time something tried to stop me for 63 years." Margaret reached into her bag and produced a program, not the Parish Hall program, that had not survived. Something else, a photograph, black and white, small, taken by someone in the audience with a camera that was not designed for theater photography, slightly blurred with the movement of a figure on a stage. A boy in costume, mid-speech, his arm extended, his face open and entirely committed to whatever the words required of it. She said, "My grandmother took this. I don't know how she got it to come out at all in that light. She kept it in her kitchen, on the windowsill, from 1958 until she died." Patrick Stewart took the photograph with both hands. He held it in the dim light of the studio and looked at it for a long time. He looked at the boy in the photograph. The boy who was him, who was 17 years old and standing on a stage in a parish hall in Muirfield in April 1958, who did not yet know that a woman in the fourth row was about to come to the stage door and give him the thing he would carry for 63 years. He said, very quietly, she kept it. Margaret said, on the windowsill. In the kitchen, where she could see it every morning. But this is the moment no one in that studio and no one watching at home ever saw coming. Patrick Stewart reached into his jacket and produced a letter. Folded, the paper slightly worn at the creases, in the way of something folded and unfolded many times across 18 years. He held it out to Margaret. He said, "I wrote to your grandmother in 1967. I was not certain the letter reached her. I wrote again in 1974 to a different address. I was not certain that one reached her either. In 2003, when I spoke about her publicly for the first time, I received your letter. I replied. I said everything in that reply that I had been trying to say since 1967. You wrote back. You told me she had passed in 1979. I have kept your letter since 2003 on my desk, where I could see it every morning. I would like to give it back to you tonight. I would like the words I wrote about her to go back to the family. I would like them to go where she is." Margaret's hands closed around the letter. She said, "She knew. I want you to know that. She watched everything. She never missed anything you did that she could find a way to see. In 1966, before the television, she took a train to London to see you at the Rusk. She didn't tell anyone she was going. She went alone. She came back and she sat at the kitchen table and she said, 'He didn't stop. He didn't let anything stop him.'" Patrick Stewart put his hand over his face. Not in performance, in the way a person covers their face when the hands are the only available shelter from something too large to receive in the open. He stood in the aisle of the Tonight Show studio with his hand over his face and 63 years of a carried thing finally, completely, finding the place it had been traveling toward. Jimmy Fallon had come down from the stage. He was standing 6 rows back with both hands pressed flat against his chest and his eyes full and his face entirely undone. Not managing it, not moderating it, simply present in the undefended way that this moment required and that he was, to his credit and perhaps his surprise, completely capable of. 300 people were standing. Not performing standing. Standing the way people stand when the body needs to be upright to hold what is happening inside it. The band had not moved. The director in the control room had said nothing for 4 minutes. She would say nothing for 4 more. Some rooms arrange themselves without direction, and this was one of them. Patrick Stewart lowered his hand. He looked at Margaret. He said, "Will you tell me about her? I know her from one evening, and from a photograph on a windowsill. Will you tell me who she was?" Margaret sat down in her seat. Patrick Stewart sat beside her, and for 22 minutes, in row 7 of the Tonight Show studio in November 2021, with the cameras rolling and the band still, and 300 people standing in the silence that 300 people can sometimes make together when they understand that silence is the only right response. A woman from Leeds told an 81-year-old knight about her grandmother, who had come to a parish hall production in April 1958 to support a minor role granddaughter, and had found, in a 4th row in Muirfield, a 17-year-old boy who was saying someone else's words as if they were the truest words anyone had ever spoken, and who had gone to the stage door afterward, because she did not know how to leave without saying so. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Margaret flew back to Leeds on a Wednesday morning with the letter in her carry-on bag and the photograph in her hand. Not packed, held. The way you hold something across an ocean when packing it would feel like a failure of attention. She placed the photograph back on the windowsill in her own kitchen when she arrived home, where it had been since her grandmother's death in 1979, where it would have been. Margaret understood now. On the morning of every day her grandmother lived after April 1958, visible from the kitchen table where she sat with her tea. Evidence of an evening in a parish hall when something had happened, and she had known immediately that she could not leave without saying so. Patrick Stewart's letter is in the wooden box on the dresser in Leeds. It sits beside the letter he wrote in 2003, which Margaret has kept for 20 years. 2 letters, 40 years apart, both of them trying to say the same thing, both of them true. The parish hall at St. Paul's Church in Muirfield is still standing. It is used for community events and occasional productions. There is no plaque on the side entrance. There is no marker indicating that on a Friday evening in April 1958, a woman stood there in the spring evening and spoke 6 sentences to a 17-year-old boy that he would carry for the rest of his life. The side entrance looks like what it is, a door in the wall of a church hall, used for exit and entrance. Unremarkable in every architectural sense. Some doors are only remarkable from the inside. Some 6 sentences spoken in an April evening to a boy in stage paint by a woman who left school at 14 and worked in a mill and knew nothing about theater except what she had felt in a 4th row that night. Some 6 sentences do the work that decades of training and craft and discipline and practice and ambition and survival are built upon. Quietly, permanently, without any of the apparatus of importance, just a woman at a door who had been given something and understood that the giving required acknowledgement. Don't let anything stop you. He didn't. She saw to it. She went to London alone in 1966 and sat in a theater and watched, and came home and sat at the kitchen table and said he didn't stop. And she was right. And she knew she was right. And she put the photograph on the windowsill where she could see it every morning. And that was enough. For some people, that is enough. To see something real in a room and say so, and then to watch it become what it was always going to become, and to know, on the mornings when you look at the photograph on the windowsill with your tea cooling beside you, that you were there at the beginning, that you saw it first, that you walked to the door and said the thing that needed to be said. That is enough. That is, in fact, everything